So just right from the get-go, Bhavachakra, wheel of life, Bhavachakra is the Sanskrit terminology. And it essentially just means two things. Pardon, I can't see any of you, and that makes me a little bit sad that I can't see anybody. Bhava chakra just consists essentially of bhava meaning to be and chakra meaning wheels, much like the chakras within our bodies. So it's essentially the wheel of being, encapsulating absolutely everything that is consisting in our lives at every moment, be it here, be it now. The bhava chakra is the mandalic depiction of everything that's occurring within our lives. Now, the primary purpose of sort of what led me to the Bhavachakra initially was just study of the Four Noble Truths, which we're all familiar with. Bill, there's a nice little piece here just for you after your great question a couple weeks ago when I was giving one of my talks. So the Four Noble Truths, as stated by the Buddha, is this is suffering, this is the source to suffering, this is the end to suffering, and this is the path to end suffering. Now, Bill asked a great question of what is meant by suffering, essentially. I mean, if I can see everybody in the group, we all seem to have homes. We all seem to have nice clothes. We all look pretty well fed. We look as if we live relatively easy lives. And I would agree that our lives are easy, especially from a biological standpoint. We're warm, we're sheltered, we're well fed. Many of us are educated, but the term suffering comes from the Sanskrit term dukkha. And I think this is only one of the two Sanskrit terms that I'll really dive into for this entire presentation. And dukkha essentially just means unsatisfactory, or even further, I would also say impermanence. So it's not so much that suffering is painful and we're in turmoil and we experience no joy, but the suffering that's related in these messages all boils down to essentially that everything is of impermanence, everything is of a transitory nature. Yet the way many of our minds work, we tend to think of things as permanent fixtures within our lives, especially in regards to, we could say our wealth, we could say our bodies, but everything is subject to change, essentially. Nothing is of eternal nature. So suffering is not painful, it's just impermanence. And so on these notes, the Four Noble Truths essentially state that our lives are impermanent. There is a source to this impermanence of suffering. There is an end to it, and there is a path. And the path is typically through the Eightfold Noble Path, which I'm not going to totally dive into that right now, be for a totally different talk. But we can begin to witness the cycles that play into suffering through the Bhavachakra. So the Bhavachakra itself, a definition that I made up, I don't know when I made it up exactly, but it seems to work, and it's become a working definition as I've established more of a relationship of studying the Bhavachakra. So I'm just calling it the mandalic depiction of the essential nature of all beings' existence and the self-perpetuating elements that traps one within illusion. And there are primary components that are playing into it. Essentially what we'll be talking about the most will be the nidanas, which is the outermost circle, and the hub. And now the hub is where I got my initial start with kind of how I was viewing my day-to-day life. And Susan, I can see you looking super close, so don't worry, I'll bring up bigger images as we move along. It's one of those things that's hard to capture in our tiny little computer screens. So we'll essentially be talking about the nidanas, the hub, and then the monster Yama that is holding the entire wheel within his arms and legs and teeth. So the primary imagery, we have the Buddha and the moon, top right and top left of the image. We have Yama, who is depicted right here, who has a third eye, a crown of skulls, a humanoid body, yet with the face of a bull, the three animals within the center. And this is just a general overview. So I'm going to dive into each aspect as we move along. the individuals rising and falling, a depiction of karma. We have the 6 realms, the biggest chunk, and the nidanas, which are essentially causal links of basically how psychological processes within our lives generate karma and essentially generate future lives, future incarnations. And it can even be pictured, I don't think that reincarnation needs to be an absolute fixture to gain benefit from what the wheel of life is depicting, but it definitely gives a broader idea of the substantial value of our lives. And we have this idea that we come from past incarnations, we are generating future incarnations. So that will be a small chunk we'll touch on, is the reincarnation element within the nidanas. So right off the bat, within the sky, we have the moon and the Buddha. The moon has the picture of a rabbit in it, and this is primarily a cultural difference. So within a lot of Eastern cultures, it's said that there is a rabbit in the moon, much how we see a man on the moon. But other depictions of the Wheel of Life will have a palace. It will have depictions of nirvana. But essentially what the moon is depicting is liberation. And that's liberation from illusion, liberation from samsara, and essentially the way away from the wheel. The Buddha, depicted within a human form, which is one of my favorite aspects of it, is essentially it's us within the top right. So although it's the Buddha, he is within a human form because he himself was human at one point and attained enlightenment, essentially giving the message that all people are capable of attaining enlightenment. And his finger pointing to the left is pointing toward liberation, which is the moon, nirvana, enlightenment, all sorts of terminology that can arise. Now, Yama, the one that is holding the wheel within his teeth, within his arms, within his feet, he is actually a Dharmapala, which is essentially a protector of the Dharma. And he has a ferocious image about him, primarily because he's there to ward off anybody who means harm to Buddhists, to Buddhism, to the Dharma. And there's a beautiful, intricate backstory, which I'm not going to totally dive into in this exact moment. Well, you know, I am going to, because I really like the story of Yama. So the importance of Yama within this is that he is the Lord of Death, or the Lord of Impermanence, and essentially that everything is subject to change. Yama came from the original story is that a man was told to retreat to a cave and meditate for 50 years to attain enlightenment. So this man retreats to the mountains, goes to his cave, and on the last night of the 49th year of meditation, right at the cusp of attaining enlightenment, a group of thieves arrive, and they arrive with a bull in tow, and they slaughter the bull, and they then realize that a man had witnessed them essentially commit a crime, kill this animal, and in return, they also kill the man in the middle of his meditation. And at this point, the rage that was within him became so much that he essentially picks up the head of the bull, places it on his own body, kills the thieves, and then begins to rain absolute terror on the world. And of course, this is all canon story, though it would be neat to picture that these things were actually happening. Who's to say they didn't? And so from there, another Dharmapala, Yamataka, who is the destroyer of death, the destroyer of impermanence, arises, and he fights Yama. And in his defeat, Yama becomes a Dharmapala. So he goes from that which plans to destroy the world to an absolute protector of Buddhism, of the Dharma. And the way that he communicates the world of impermanence is through his own divine messengers, which we're all incredibly familiar with. It's birth, aging, sickness, and death. The things that are sure to happen, things that we witness are of change, aging, sickness, death, grand transformations. Impermanence to me is basically another way of stating transformation. So he sends to us the great teachings of the baby without autonomy, the aging of the body, the sickness of the body, and the witness of death in our entire lives as a way to teach us of impermanence. Yet with the way we tend to live our lives now, we like to think of ourselves as permanent fixtures, and as age sets in and ailments set in and family members begin to leave and family members begin to change and we follow in those footsteps, all of this confusion will tend to arise. And we tend to live much of our lives as if these are unexpected circumstances that nobody could have pictured. And before we know it, we're subject to change. So it's wonderful thinking that a ferocious entity such as Yama, who's actually a protector, is constantly sending messages to everybody within the world that everything is subject to change, especially the bodies we currently inhabit. Now for the, oh, and you know what? Just a small disclaimer, if anybody wants me to step back to look at the bigger image, I have no problem going back and forth between slides because I'll kind of be moving between pieces. So I can easily go to prior slides in case we want to get the full picture later on. Because right now what we're looking at is the hub, the exact center of what Yama is holding. So the three animals, the disturbing emotions, this is what initially caught my attention with the Wheel of Life. And I really didn't study much else beyond just the three animals for some time because their depiction itself was already, it made enough of an impact in ways that I went about my day-to-day life that I really didn't have a concern with understanding the bigger picture of what's occurring in the Bhavachakra. So the pig is the source of ignorance, the snake is aggression, and the chicken is passion or anger. And there are other depictions of the animals within the center where it will be the pig, and within the pig's mouth is the snake and the chicken, essentially showing that the pig is the source of, or I should say, ignorance is the source of our aggression and our passions in life. And ignorance, you know, we're going to talk about ignorance a little bit later. So ignorance is, yeah, the surface level. Aggression and passion act from there, and from there on, it's becomes easier and easier as we see where we act from ignorance, from aggression, and from passion, how everything else tends to follow with ease in terms of how we approach individuals, how we approach our daily lives, the choices we make, our own internal monologue. And it's really, it almost becomes a game to a certain degree to see how you ended up in a certain circumstance and seeing where everything came from, boiling it down to how we act with aggression, how we act with passion, and how we act with ignorance, essentially. So I spent a decent chunk of time just with the three animals, the disturbing emotions. Disturbing emotions is one of my favorite phrases that I picked up out of one of the handful of books that I've been using to study. And it's a wonderful phrase, not because it has sort of a grotesqueness to it, because we're all acting, I mean, to one degree or another. I don't think any of us have not acted from a place of ignorance, passion, or aggression in our lives. But the reason why I like the phrase disturbing is that there's not a grotesque element behind it, but because it tends to disrupt how we go about our day-to-day lives and how we interact with people. And it's creating these disturbances of being able to see true relationships, true values, and more closely interacting with true reality, essentially. And so when we act from ignorance, aggression, and passion, it's almost creating these ripples in our own minds that leave the bottom of the river of life harder and harder to work with. But then again, I mean, it's hard not to live in the world that we live in with the amount of exposure we have to what's happening in the world and not have these emotions arise. So it's fun to acknowledge emotions arising and seeing where it's coming from and how they really are set into motion and sort of hit other dominoes along the way. So that's where the phrase of disturbing really hits home for me. Now, the the individuals that are rising and falling. This is the depiction of karma. And I almost have issue with how karma is depicted in this way. So I'm actively sitting with this imagery of the people rising and falling, because it's a depiction of good and bad karma. But in reality, karma is just karma. There's no good, there's no bad. Karma simply just means action to do. There's no connotation of judgment. There's no connotation of discernment. This is just simply the law and action of cause and effect, essentially. Everything else that we kind of like to pile on with, oh, I'm getting good karma from this, or oh, that's bad karma for you. I've started joking to myself that we've almost killed karma and we've just basically renamed God karma. But in reality, there's no judgment associated with it. So it's interesting talking to karma with people, because it's almost as if there's a justification in understanding how karma works and the actions that we commit and what we receive. And it's almost as if actions are committed on banking on the idea that our return on investment is going to be really key and we're going to get good karma in return. But in reality, and this is just my personal idea, I almost find it hard to believe that there can be such an understanding of karma prevalent that we will know what is a matching cause, or I should say a matching effect to a cause that occurs. Because the way that the world works, we have our good and our bad guys, and we would think that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. But more often than not, I feel like we all know people that we might want to call bad, but good things always happen to them. And we know good people where it seems that bad things are always happening to them. And that's because karma, I think, operates free of a way that we can justify it or that we can explain it. It's just that karma is actively occurring. The cause and effect is always in motion within our lives. One of my favorite examples, and I fell into this really great conversation with my mom because I had lost a family member last year, early 40s, and she had passed away from cancer. And we were trying to make sense of, well, how does something like this occur to somebody? A beautiful mother, kindest individual, always there for every family member. And we just fell into this conversation of, how do things like this happen to people like Angie? And I remember thinking to my mom, I said, well, you know what, maybe it was just the time that she had to go in regards to her life was so full and she made such an impact. And the sort of ripples that the death of somebody so good really, really sparked this growth and development within my own family. And everybody became much closer. So at first glance, you go, ooh, death. What a horrible thing to happen to this individual. But in the wake of this one's death, it really sparked sort of a level of love that I didn't realize was capable or was possible of happening. So it's really interesting playing with what our notions of good and our notions of bad could be and what the sort of effects that we see. And it's a lot of watching, it's a lot of witnessing, but in reality, working with karma is really just a matter of letting things be exactly as they are. Because as soon as we start labeling everything, then we're playing God almost to what's naturally occurring right on time in our lives. So the 6 realms, there's a lot of neat implications that stem from the 6 realms. Now these top ones, let's see. So right at the top, we have gods, which are individuals in a beautiful palace. There's music, there's food, there are individuals dancing, a blue sky behind them. There's an individual sitting over here eating fruit from this tree that seems to be growing from another realm. And it's a life of leisure. There are no struggles in the realm of gods. and everything is of ease, essentially, or seemingly of ease, I should say. The realm of demigods off to the right, it's a sort of equal depiction. We have individuals within shelter, a beautiful building, beautiful clothing. There is a guru of some sort sitting off to the side, and there are individuals that are receiving teachings from this person. Now, within the realm of demigods, there is a tree growing from it, and this tree branches off into the realm of gods. And what we can actively see is that the demigods are reaching for the fruit, but it is just out of reach, whereas the gods reap all the benefits of the demigods. So this is essentially a depiction of jealousy to a certain degree. Another name for the demigods is the jealous gods realm, which I think is much more fitting, but demi kind of sounded fancy when I was working on this at, I think, like 1 a.m. last night. I thought I'd mix it up and take away jealous for one presentation. Off to the side, we have humans, and this would be an accurate depiction of many of our lives. There are people working, there are people engaging in study, there are people with shelter, much like the jealous gods or the demigods. But we are living these mundane lives of working, accumulating, feeling emotions. It's one of the most accurate realms in terms of living and learning from the Dharma itself. For spiritual development, the realm of humans is considered like the Goldilocks zone, essentially, of engaging in the trials and tribulations of life without being crushed, without acting from ignorance and thinking things are permanent. The realm of humans is a spot-on depiction to engage in life without succumbing to it almost. Now, the realm of animals down on the bottom left, which there was an individual in a previous talk who asked a great question. And so it's always going to stick with me from here on out. So with the animals, it's almost a realm of pure instinct, where we are fighting to survive. We are simply eating to survive. Everything is on instinct. There's no sort of, or I should say, there's minimal critical thought that's occurring within the realm of animals. Now, this isn't to say that things within an animal incarnation don't lack any sort of compassion or empathy, or that level of consciousness, because I think we've all had those cats or those dogs where you look at them and it's almost like you're looking at a person, and it's sort of like I know that when you're done with this incarnation, you're probably not going to be coming back in the same form. It's almost uncanny how some animals can feel. So it's not saying that all animals are a pure instinct, but it's more of the mindset, because people can easily act in animalistic ways. We see it every single day. People operating on instinct, people operating on pure survival. And so this is where we're hitting the point of the lower realms. I mean, the idea of higher and lower is kind of ridiculous in my opinion, but in a lot of the texts, you'll see the higher realms and the lower realms, because it really does, as we're looking through the realms, the progressions at which you fall into them becomes heavier and heavier to a certain degree. So we go from the animals, and off to the right, we have hungry ghosts. Now, the hungry ghost is depicted by people with enlarged abdomens, elongated, thin necks. And essentially what's being depicted here is that these people are trying to accumulate as much as possible, but the restrictions of their neck only allow so much to reach their abdomens. And so by the time food reaches the abdomen and digestion occurs, they are hungry before the next round of food essentially gets there. So it's a world of constant consumption, where even in the midst of consumption is still on the mind. There's nothing in regards to spiritual development that's occurring. It's purely biological attainment to a certain degree. And down at the bottom, we have the depiction of hell. And in a lot of Tibetan Buddhist teachings, hell seems to be really fun to talk about. And there's so many different depictions of hell between, a body that is reincarnated to be dropped into some sort of magma over and over and over again. There are ones where the body freezes over and over. There are ones of illusion based in the idea of you're walking through a desert and you see a jungle filled with fruit in the trees, and the individuals run straight into the jungle trying to attain the fruit, only to find out that every single leaf within the jungle is razor sharp and it essentially cuts them to bits right there in the moment. It's wonderfully graphic. And it's totally out of the blue whenever I start kind of poking around in the hells. Everything seems incredibly palatable and digestible. Nothing too crazy. And then you get into realms of hell and it just really goes 0 to 10 in terms of severity that's present. So it's an accurate depiction, though, I think, of how a lot of our lives turn out, where we really imagine that the world is a lot more intense than it actually is. And we'll kind of get in the next slide, we'll kind of see how this comes into play. But there's really an element about the world where everything is occurring exactly as it is. Many of us, it's pretty rare. Obviously, it's not like it doesn't occur ever, but it's pretty rare that we can be in true harm's way. And a lot of it is depictions of the mind that we are in severe danger. And so that's what I kind of like about the idea of hell. It's almost as a incredibly severe depressive state where you are so enshrouded in your own thoughts, in your own feelings, in your own turmoil, that the world outside of your own feelings in that moment is borderline non-existent. And it's really interesting when those states arise in your own life, and you know exactly what's happening. You can see the depressive state, you're enshrouded in the depressive state, and we look in our fridges for something good to eat, but all of your favorite foods all of a sudden sound dull and boring. Perhaps music will alleviate the mood, but none of your music brings satisfaction anymore. It's this sort of grand imagining that everything is horrible to a certain degree, but in reality, everything is exactly how it was before. We've only dressed it up to be something terrible. So that's kind of the depiction of hell that a lot of people, myself included, can really entrap ourselves into. So the fun thing with the 6 realms, and this was it's a super simple misconception to have, is that we would think that we would want to strive for the realm of gods, and that we would want to be gods, and we want to have dancers and music and fresh fruit and all these learnings available. But there's a double-edged sword to every single realm that's really fun to play with. So with gods, there is this level of comfort that it's almost as if one's self-defenses in terms of spiritual development fall. So we can live our entire lives with wealth. We can live our entire lives in a beautiful home. But then this clinging arises when perhaps our bodies start to wear out and death is around the corner, that all of a sudden these material, what's the word I'm looking for? These comforts that we've had our entire lives, these comforts that we've grown accustomed to, comforts that have never been threatened to be taken away, they begin to leave the view. They begin to step into the peripherals. And as they leave our sight, it creates this anxiety and this clinging. In a lot of the commentary that comes forward, it'll state, especially in moments of death, when people are saying goodbye to the physical world, a lot of that is saying goodbye to the comforts. And what will life be without the comforts of the world that have been at my side the entire time? So clinging is sort of one of those byproducts of living in the realm of gods. Now, with the jealous gods, they're essentially living the exact same lives, but the jealous gods live in this realm that everything is actively being taken away. So it's almost as if you have, the creme de la creme of lifestyles, absolutely gorgeous, everything you could ever need, but you are you're tainted with the poisonous thought that everything is actively being taken away. So it's almost as if in the jealous gods, you're constantly grasping for everything as if it will be gone at any moment, which is a great mindset, in my opinion, because everything is actively leaving, but it's the clinging element that can be the real poison in the midst. Is this idea that we're trying to keep things still and we're not allowing things to change as they need to change. And now the realm of humans, the one we're all in, I think we can all picture the struggles. And I mean, we see a lot of the struggles that arise in the world, but there's just enough comfort that's present within the realm of humans. I mean, it's Sunday, 4:30 p.m., and it's absolutely beautiful in Seattle. And we're all here, but we all have this choice to go sit in the sun. We all have a choice to go have a beer with friends. We all have these choices of more, quote unquote, relaxing environments that we can step into. And a lot of people do choose this life. I mean, even I choose that life sometimes, but I kind of like to find that balance between learning and studying and then enjoying the splendors of the world at the exact same time. But the byproduct that comes from the realm of humans is this complacency and this comfort that we can live birth to death and not necessarily have anything go wrong. We can get our education, we can get a job, we can have beautiful families, grow older, leave something for our families in return. So it's not to say that a life lived in that regard is, worthy of judgment, because that would just be silly. But it's easy to fall into the patterns of the human life of attainment and leaving things behind and growing complacent and not taking advantage of the learning opportunity of understanding exactly how one's own mind works. And I always kind of preface it as like, the reason why I study a lot of these things is because the questions started popping up and the depression started popping up, and I really wanted to know what was happening. And I think we see it a lot in spiritual groups where, it's almost as if there's that person trying to convince you that the world is terrible so that they can teach you about how to get over how terrible the world is. But in reality, the world's beautiful. And I'm not going to convince somebody that they're suffering at all times of the day just so I can then teach them how to get over the suffering that I planted in their own noggin. So that's one of those kind of playful elements that goes into the human realm, is that, there are those who are learning, there are those who simply live, and then there are those who grow to such levels of complacency and perhaps fall into such consumption and self-defense that it slips down into the realm of animals, where we're not preparing for what could happen around the corner. We're not preparing for all of the unexpected turns. Granted, everything is both unexpected and unexpected to a certain degree, but it really enacts this mindset of pure instinct that people operate on. And we see it all the time. I mean, we turn on the TV, we look at the internet. Hell, you can even, most of us could even look out our homes and see pure instinct walking up and down the street. It's not uncommon, but it's sort of the lack of preparation and the lack of learning, perhaps, that allows that instinct, that instinctual nature to arise, and that allows for the slip down into the realm of animals. So the reason why I wanted to do the top 3 realms, simply because I don't want the idea to be present that we want to be gods and we want to avoid hell. I mean, essentially, I think all of us would want to avoid hell to a certain degree. So I didn't feel that compelled to convince you why hell would probably not be the best place. But I did want to allow for the description of the gods and the demigods as to how their comforts in life are pure illusion and almost pure ignorance to a certain degree, of thinking that comfort and joy in life is through material possessions and maintaining material wealth at the same time. So the 6 realms are super cool. Let's see. The 6 realms are really neat because you'll find commentary where it states that we are perhaps born into a realm, But in reality, I think the realms are more of a depiction of one's own consciousness, of one's own ego, of how we picture and work with the world, essentially. And I always kind of think how some of my days, I feel like I'm always bouncing between, human, hell. I step outside and perhaps I get a delicious beverage and now I'm in the realm of gods. And my entire day is just this wild fluctuation between the realms. So it's fun taking note of, and obviously without overthinking it, but kind of seeing the fluidity of one's own mind in regards to how we are always within these different statuses and these ideas of a life that we're living. So with Yama, this was one of those things that hit me last night. Yama is depicted with a crown of skulls, and it's the five skandhas. And long story short, because I don't want to spend a whole lot of time just talking about the skandhas give rise to how one's ego or consciousness comes into fruition. And so form, the bodily form, feeling, perception, impulse, concept, and consciousness. And so it's all about this way of how our thoughts, our feelings, perceptions, the way we conceptualize things, it gives rise to the sort of judgmental factor that arises that keeps us from seeing the true nature of an event, the true nature of reality. We see something happening down the street and immediately we place a certain level of judgment over it, of whether it be good, whether it be bad, perhaps something you want or something you want to avoid. There's always these levels of ego and consciousness through conceptualization that arise that really, I think, are throwing us into the six realms. In our minds, the mind is just endlessly fascinating and how fast it's actively working. And it never seems to be, at least, some of our minds, because I know some of the people in this group have some of the most still minds that I've ever had the blessings of interacting with. And I don't hope for to be in that route one day, but it's neat to imagine that activity of the mind can be slowed down to a degree, or not necessarily slowed down. The activity of the mind can rest still so that the true nature of an event can arise, and we're not so afflicted by judgments and constantly labeling things, essentially. And our minds are working in this way where they're so fast that sometimes I swear I'm conceptualizing 10, 15, 20 different things all at once. Be it I look at a painting on my wall, be it I see two people arguing outside, be it I go on the internet and read a news article. There's all these concepts that are constantly arising that are kind of throwing the ego and the consciousness in all of these different directions. And it makes it really fun to engage with how we end up in certain realms throughout the day. And, I would be absolutely exhausted if my entire life was completely based around, keeping track of perhaps where my mind is in terms of realms. So this is where it's always, I always say meditation is one of the most crucial aspects that I think we can step into, because it allows for that space and that stillness that we can really rest into to give rise of how mental processes are actively occurring in our lives day in and day out. And especially just reflecting to what happens in our days. Because there are times when perhaps days or weeks will go by and I won't even realize the subtle mental state that I had been in for so long. And then all of a sudden it's as if a bubble pops and then the reality of the matter is totally present and everything kind of makes sense in that brief regard. So it's not so much that this, we should be tracking our brains at all times, because that doesn't sound fun. And we'd probably miss out on the experiences of hanging out with our kids, our grandkids, of enjoying the time we spend with our families, or perhaps the beverage that we may go get every morning. Because there are so many things occurring that the obsessive nature of trying to keep track of the mind, I think, is one of the biggest distractions that can arise, of trying to control every thought that pops up at the same time. I could have gone to this one. So the transmigrations as ego, and this was just an idea that arose yesterday, that through our feelings, our perceptions, our conceptualizations gives rise to this consciousness. And the consciousness, we'll touch on this in a second, consciousness itself is incredibly interesting because consciousness doesn't arise and then end and then a new one steps in. It's under constant transformation. And I think sometimes that's the real suffering of consciousness to a certain degree, is that it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. Perhaps it's growing, perhaps it's shrinking, but nonetheless, it's almost never staying the same. And this is the consciousness that is perceiving through judgment. Because I mean, we could have an entire conversation on consciousness and the different facets of what it really plays into in our day-to-day lives. But consciousness in this regard is borderline synonymous with ego, constantly changing, constantly validating our ideas of who we think we are, of how we think the world is. And as soon as any sort of disagreement to the validation of ourselves arises, or perhaps against the validation of how we perceive the world, it creates this turmoil, giving rise to disturbing emotions, passion, aggression, and ignorance. So the mental processes that really come into play in terms of how we are generating karma through ego generation, through living in the six realms, are with the causal links. Now, the first link being ignorance, and this is the only other Sanskrit term I'll use. Now, ignorance, I had taken it for granted that I had a specific definition or a specific understanding of what ignorance was. And then I started having these conversations of how ignorance, well, you know what? I'm going to jump straight into the Sanskrit term. So avidya is the term for ignorance in Sanskrit. Now with the prefix a on avidya, and I thought I had written it on here, but that's a-okay. The prefix a is essentially the negation. So it's no. And now vidya in Sanskrit means to know, or knowledge, wisdom, understanding. So the only thing that avidya means is a lack of understanding, to not know. It's not so much that one is ignorant. It's simply that the space for wisdom and understanding and knowledge can arise. And that was one of those perceptions in my own brain of working with the phrase ignorance, is it's not that you are either ignorant or you are enlightened. It's simply that you are wise or you are simply yet to be wise, which really turned out how I view the world sort of upside down to a certain degree, because a lot of us operate with this judgment mind. And Andrew and I had this great conversation recently about the judgment mind and the comparison mind. We were saying, well, how do we operate with comparison without judgment? And I think one of the harshest judgments that I had to get over was claiming that people were ignorant. But in reality, they were just operating from a space of not quite understanding. And if I'm ever saying something that isn't correct, I would feel a whole lot better about myself if somebody said, well, you don't simply understand the entire picture, rather than being called an ignoramus or something like that. Because it gives this idea that people aren't stationary in their position. They aren't stuck in a state of ignorance. They're simply in a process of understanding. So that's where ignorance comes from. And ignorance is incredibly interesting in regards to kind of how it seeps into our lives, because there is acting from a place of ignorance, but then there's almost this level of ignorance that I like to picture as, this is where the misunderstanding concept comes into play. Ignorance is almost like gravity, where we can't see gravity, we can't touch gravity, we can't put gravity in a jar, but we can see the effects of it all around us at all times. And so everything is not so much that we can see the cause, but the effects are constantly present within our lives. And if there's one place where I feel ignorance is constantly present, is it's in my own mind of misunderstanding the reality of nature and the reality of people, and essentially the reality of life as it is. So this is there's a little bit of, I mean, I wouldn't say dispute, because there's no point in arguing any of this, but ignorance is used as the first nidana. But there are also other commentaries on the nidanas where perhaps old age and death would be the first causal link. But in this regard, and from my own understanding and reading, I like using ignorance because it provides, I think, a more, I would say, a more flexible foundation for the rest of the links to follow it to a certain degree, keeping in mind that it's not like, things end at old age and death and then it's said and done, because everything just picks right back up upon old age and death. If we adhere to the idea that reincarnation is occurring, and I know a lot of us, believe that reincarnation is actively occurring, be it strange memories or the interactions we have with people, it seems that reincarnation is highly probable. So on that note, death is not the end. And in fact, death is just an illusion anyway. Nothing is actually happening. Pardon me. We'll pretend that I'm putting on some mood music in the background, but somebody's car alarm going wild out there. So ignorance being the first nidana that's occurring within the causal links, it leads to action. And this is where we would see the pig holding on to the chicken and the snake. And from here is where we really begin to set into motion one's consciousness. And I put two-part in there. I really should have deleted it because I don't feel like talking about it in its entirety right now. But this is giving rise to the notion that our consciousness, as a result of one's actions, is kind of bleeding forward. There's no end to the consciousness of one action, and then we pick up a new consciousness along the way. It's active transformation that's occurring. And this is what really builds what I would call complex webs in our own life, where things tend to overlay one another and things seem to be incredibly confusing, but it's only because we are acting from this place of constant action, perhaps ignorance, misunderstanding is really what's occurring, that is allowing the consciousness to sort of spiral out of control to a certain degree. Now, name and form would obviously be our bodies. The five aggregates come into play here. The six sense spheres being self-explanatory of the senses that we all have. The term spheres is really neat in this regard because I could have just put the six senses. Sometimes it's called the six sense bases, and that would be, our ability to see, our ability to touch. But the idea of the spheres comes into play, that there is an active feedback that's occurring between what we perceive of being internal and what we perceive as being external. So what would there be to touch if we had the faculty of touch, but nothing around us to register this sense, essentially? And the six sense spheres is really interesting too, because it's not so much talking about the physical form of one's eyeballs, of our skin, of our tongue, of our ears. It's talking about the sort of subtle energies that are within that allow us to hear, allow us to taste, because we all know that there are individuals who have eyeballs, who have ears, who have tongues, but perhaps the faculty that follows with that biological development is not present. So this is relating to the more subtle energy that allows one to perceive through the senses. Contact, super self-explanatory. The example that I always like using is the hot pan as a little kid, and it doesn't take long for a small child to learn to not touch the pan that's on the stove, perhaps because there's the one touch. But contact is really interesting because there's that brief moment where there's no feeling developed yet. So we touch the item that's hot, and we don't have the preconceived notion available thinking the pan is hot, it's on the stove. And so there's a moment where heat does not register. Now that's contact. There's no perception of it quite yet. There's no negative association with it. It's the simple contact before the pain comes. And then arises feeling, attachment, and grasping. I'm going to talk about these in more detail because I like referring to them as the bread and butter, the thing we're actively working with day in and day out for many of our lives is the feeling, attachment, and grasping, what really tends to spiral us out of control. So feeling would be the heat of the pan reaches the brain, and now we are registering that there is some sort of pain-inducing element. Now, attachment is interesting in regards to pain because it's the attachment to the absence of pain. But we have attachment present, and I'm sure we could easily list several attachments that we have, be it warm showers, favorite pillow, favorite food, all these things that we kind of grow attached to. For me, it would be music. The amount of time that I spend thinking about the music that I want to listen to in the moment's fleeing as I'm sitting there trying to decide. So that's my own thing of attachment that's constantly going. Grasping is, once we have the thing and there's the potential for it to go, we hold on to it, thinking that it will be an eternal aspect within our lives. Now, becoming, birth, old age, and death, they're slightly more conceptual, but also not conceptual at the same time. So becoming, this is where I've kind of gotten a smidge creative, and who knows if I've accidentally stumbled into the right thing, but it's almost as if with the grasping element that occurs, it gives rise to a new consciousness that's born in that moment. So we feel something, we become attached to it, we grasp, and then the consciousness arises that we have the thing or we don't have the thing, and we will continue going on like that, giving rise perhaps to an idea of being in the six realms. Perhaps we're in the God realm now that we have this ice cream cone. Perhaps we're in the hell realm because we don't have our ice cream cone. All these different things that are throwing the mind all over the place. And so that's how, some of these concepts are really great because it's almost, it's really difficult to put them into words because there's such a fluidity and complexity within all of our own lives that it's really just a matter of saturating ourselves with specific words that they start to make sense. And then some of us decide we need to communicate it. And then some of us sit with our understanding, which is wonderful. Now, birth, old age, and death, these occur with one another. And this is another idea that I was just kind of recently thinking about of why are birth, old age, and death right by each other? Why isn't it perhaps birth and then ignorance, action, consciousness, all the way to old age and death? And the idea that I play with, and it's kind of one of those things where, we try to make sense of complex happenings within our lives, is that some people, I think, are born into an incarnation where they've gone through this so many times over and over again that there's no space for ignorance, there's no space for action, there's no space for consciousness to a certain degree. Obviously, these are occurring to a certain level, but I always think, how is it that a newborn child can pass so soon? How is it that people who've lived such pure lives pass too soon? I think, well, perhaps this has happened so many times before. And this is my judgment mind coming into play. Perhaps this has occurred so many times before that there's no more space to live in ignorance. There's no more space to generate karma for future incarnations. It's simply a life of birth, old age, and death. Just an idea that I'm playing with, actively playing with most days, I would say. And this is what kind of the wheel, the Bhavachakra, has allowed me to sort of play with different concepts in life, because there are so many happenings that a lot of people will say, well, perhaps it was just meant to happen. There's a plan for things like this. And I'm like, man, I really hate these plans. There's got to be something bigger out there that's explaining these happenings in life. Because in reality, I mean, people are actively dying. People are actively born. One is treated with, sadness and depression. Another one is treated with excitement. But in reality, all of the emotions that are projected over these happenings in our day-to-day lives, they're just things that are happening. Everything else is just flavor added on behalf of our own minds. All the excitement, all of the turmoil, it's just our minds essentially having a lot of fun with what's happening in the present moment. So Susan, for your sake, I have the pictures more up close because I mean, nobody wants to try to look at these closely. So links 1 through 3, ignorance, action, consciousness, included the phrase avidya, not so much that it is ignorance, but it is a lack of understanding, to not understand, to not know, depicted by a man with a cane, an elderly man with a cane, essentially giving the notion that the individual is not only unstable on his own feet, but if the cane were to be gone, there's complete instability in the understanding of the world. Action is depicted by the individual creating pots, essentially giving rise to forms, which are karma. Consciousness being the monkey reaching for the fruit. And essentially, I kind of like thinking about it. Well, I like thinking about it in regards to Adam and Eve, but I mean, my understanding of Adam and Eve is so slim, but I like this idea of giving rise to one's own consciousness through the fruits of the world. And it really begins this engagement and this dance with the world we're living in. Might as well be like an ice cream or like a frappuccino tree or something, of constantly reaching for the thing that we desire. A name and form, the constant depiction of we've all kind of heard the phrase of the individual in the boat crossing the great stream, only to find out that perhaps what's on the other side is enlightenment, the age-old story. Sixth sense spheres giving rise, there's the house next to the stream. So it creates the concrete form of the body. Each of the windows is a depiction of one's own senses. So 6 windows, 6 senses. And then contact, are the 2 people coming into contact with one another. I kind of like thinking about it in this idea that, we have this idea that people are apart from ourselves, but in reality, we're kind of all one to a certain degree. So this idea of perceiving an individual as outside of yourself is lately what comes to mind when I look at the contact image of the 2 people touching each other by the hands. Feeling is an accurate, such a perfect depiction of how feelings arise in our lives. So the individual down here, he has an arrow in his eye, and this is the depiction of feeling in regards to when you have, if you had an arrow in your eye, everything beyond that arrow does not exist in the moment. There's nothing, and this is something that keeps popping up. You're never more present than when you stub your own toe. And in that moment, you are your stubbed toe. The feeling just overrides absolutely everything. And that's what you are living within. Attachment, or the individuals having a party. The thing that comes to mind, and this is just from, me trying to pay attention to what's occurring in my life day in and day out. What comes to mind is, you're with friends, you're in good company, you're having a great meal, and you're so enraptured in the moment of how wonderful it is that we kind of forget that it's going to come to an end to a certain degree. And then before we know it, perhaps the dinner, perhaps the party has come to an end. Perhaps we've gone home at this point and we lay in our bed and the day goes by and there's no acknowledgement that the thing that we were anticipating or the thing we were enjoying in the moment was going to end, but things are just constantly moving along. And so as the years go by, and I mean, I feel like this a lot lately, is that there's so much that seems to be occurring with people that are my age in terms of we're doing this, we're doing that. There's always a place to go. There's always the food to eat. But in reality, it's just the levels of attachment that as soon as you get one, then there needs to be the other. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love going to get good food every now and then, but it's almost as if a world without the attachment of clinging to the next great hike, clinging to the next great piece of food, nothing really exists beyond that in a world where we're not striving. So that's kind of how I've actively been working with the idea of attachment, the nidana of attachment. Now, grasping is when the awareness arises that something is coming to an end. The ideal story that I've heard depicting grasping is how monkeys in Southeast Asia are caught, and they get a coconut. The people put a hole in the coconut, put some sort of sweet substance on the inside, and the hole is just big enough that a monkey can reach his hand within when the fingers are outstretched, and then they grab the substance, and then with the clenched fist can't gain faculty of their own hands. And there's this balance that comes into play of grasping for the sweet substance, but not knowing that if one just loosened their hand, that they could have the faculty back. And so for some reason, the image popped up in my head that if a monkey could continue to sprout arms, no matter the amount of sweet substances that would arise, we'd still be putting our hands in coconuts to create clenched fists and lose the faculty of the hand over and over and over again. And how neat would it be if we needed another arm, we had the other arm, but we can't stop grasping for the sweet substance over and over. So that's just one of those silly images that's popped up in my head. And I actively see it occurring in my mind too, the grasping element that arises, be it my own home, be it the food I'm running out of. And there's always this degree of, before it's even done, I'm already grasping for the next experience of filling that void of what's soon to be over. The clenched fist mentality that never seems to escape with some things. Now, becoming, down at the bottom, the only other Sanskrit word, I promise. Becoming means Bhavachakra, to be. I just wanted to make that distinction in there, that this is, the becoming of one's consciousness, the arrival of one's new state, now that the grasping has been attained, now that we've attained the thing that we've wanted so bad, and it is now within our grasp. We've essentially given rise to a new state of consciousness, essentially. And then birth, aging, and death. The depictions here are relatively clear. Under becoming, it's two individuals having sex, and then the woman giving birth, and then the individuals at the very end carrying the pots being depictions of their own karma, as we saw in the action nidana of the person creating the pots. And now upon their backs, they carry the karma of their past, essentially. And this is just a big frame picture. We could talk about this for a little while, but I wanted to keep it small scale, because in all honesty, everything from the Bhavachakra at this moment in my own life, it doesn't matter unless there's a degree of application that can occur in terms of making sense of one's own doings. So from some of the texts that I've come across, this isn't my own interpretation. I'm basically just regurgitating what I've seen. So I don't want anybody to think I'm a reincarnation expert, because that would be pretty cool, but it would also be lying, and I don't want to be lying to any of you. So reincarnation, the first 2.5 links are depicted as one's past life, and this is where the dual aspect of consciousness comes into play. And it being ignorance, action, and then the cause consciousness. And now the cause consciousness is what bleeds into the effect consciousness of the present life, thus creating name and form, 6 sense spheres, contact, feeling, attachment, grasping, then existence or becoming. I forgot to switch the word there. And then the future, which is birth, old age, and death. Now, the fun thing to think about here, just in terms of perspective, is that we are not only, technically, yes, we are in the present, but while living in the present, we're technically living a past life and we're living out a future life simultaneously. So the nidanas are all actively occurring simultaneously to a certain degree. Well, not to a certain degree, to a T, we are experiencing all nidanas simultaneously. And this is where the misunderstanding of ignorance can really come into play, is that the misunderstanding of ignorance is that there is not a clear understanding of how one's actions result in specific cause or result in specific effects. And then the other little point I'll occasionally see is there is not a true understanding of reality or the true nature of reality, which basically kind of encapsulates, the understanding of karma. But in reality, this idea that there is a misunderstanding present of one's own causes and the effects to follow, that's really the most crucial element that comes out of the nidanas. And there's a lot of, I feel like we all have that 2020 hindsight thing more often than not in our lives. And everything makes so sense when we are able to see the step-by-step of what occurred that resulted in a specific effect in our lives. And a lot of that is just simple misunderstanding, because the world appears to be complex, but in reality, it becomes a lot less complex when we really start to examine one's own causes and the effects that tend to follow. So this is why I wanted to include the reincarnation aspect into it, is that we don't go, there's no checkbox mentality of, okay, cool, got my name and form, and then there's some sort of record that's being checked that we got the name and form, and then we act on our six senses. Everything's occurring at the exact same time all the time. We're living in the future, we're living in the past, we're living in the present, and everything to follow is essentially just seeking understanding. And that's what the Bhavachakra is depicting for us. So now we have back to the full image. We started with the Buddha and the moon. We took a brief glimpse at Yama, the hub where I initially started my incredibly rudimentary study of the wheel, followed by the idea that karma has no judgment. Karma is just to do. We have the six realms, which can be, a incarnation we are born into, but I like to think of it more as a projection of one's own ego or consciousness in the present moment. And then all of this comes to arise from the 12 nidanas, starting at the top with ignorance. We move all the way around until we hit feeling, attachment, and grasping, the real fun ones of where much of our lives are actively occurring, especially this feeling element. I kind of find it hard to remember the last time I didn't have a feeling about something. It's one of those lovely, tricky things that are always intruding, all the way through to becoming, birth, old age, and death, all encapsulated within Yama, who is the Lord of Death, the Lord of Impermanence, subjecting everything to change. Meanwhile, being so polite as he is polite looking to send us the divine messengers of birth, aging, sickness, and death, simultaneously, to essentially awaken us to the idea that the world is of an impermanent nature, that the world is of a nature of suffering, of unsatisfactoriness, or of impermanence. Now, the thing that's really fun about the Wheel of Life is that it's simply just an image. The notion of a mandala is really cool because it's just placing high-level concepts into an easily visually digestible format. So, once we have the idea that there's the animals and then the two facets of karma, the six realms, the 12 nidanas, there's all these iterations that are occurring. And it's simply just a guide to sort of allow the mind to picture perhaps how the world does operate to a certain degree. Because I really don't think, we could ask for a more clear image of how the world is operating within its own faculties beyond a still image that's showing everything that's occurring all at once. So that being said, there are a whole bunch of depictions of the Wheel of Life. you'll see Yama sometimes with different colors. The realms can be pictured slightly differently. There's really kind of corny iterations that are made for like a more modern audience. But I mean, I get it. It's a modern depiction of ancient concepts, but yet they still reign supreme, in my opinion, in terms of understanding the complexities of life. But that being said, it's really just an image, and the understanding is just actively occurring in our own minds and that development. And we just have the image to sort of perhaps start the engine to get the understanding going.